Hi, ladies. Sorry I couldn't be there with you today, but I still wanted to go over the rest of World War II with you. So I've recorded this, and I'm putting the full version of the notes up so you guys can get them copied down while listening to my comments as well. Now, whoever this wonderful sub over here is can certainly pause this or rewind or whatever you guys need to do as you're watching this in order to keep up. Also, this is probably going to take two videos because the thing's going to cut me off at 15 minutes. So anyway, I'll get going in a second. I hope you guys enjoyed, in honor of the springy weather, taking this Garden Springs Green quiz. And I will mention the answers to that really quickly as well. The American general in number one was future President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The costly victory for the Soviets was at Stalingrad. VE Day stands for Victory in Europe Day. The Japanese suicide pilots were kamikazes, and the city where the first atomic bomb was dropped was Hiroshima. So, with all of that behind us, I'm going to remove my face from the screen because you guys just don't need to see that. And we'll start talking about the end of World War II here. All right, so let's talk about the Allied victory in World War II. And we'll start with that photograph you're seeing right there. It was rumored for years that this was just kind of staged, but that turns out to not be true, although this was the second raising of a flag on the island of Iwo Jima, part of that island hopping campaign we talked about last class after the Americans took that island. Interesting note, there are several statues based off of this, and some of them have weird extra hands that don't seem to belong to anyone. Also, out of the 6 men in this photograph, 3 of them died before leaving the island. In further battle, the other 3 kind of became sort of celebrities and they came back home. This is probably the most iconic photograph of the entire war. So when you talk about the big 3 leaders of the Allied countries, you're talking about British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, U.S. President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and of course Stalin for the Soviet Union. There was some disagreement. Stalin wanted the Allies to open up another front in France in the West because basically the Soviet Union was suffering, as we talked about last time, from the German invasion, and they wanted them to have to fight a 2-front war to take a little pressure off. Ultimately, though, Churchill decides he wants to strike not in France, but at German possessions and German troops in the north of Africa and the southern part of Europe as well. So they begin the North Africa campaign in the summer of 1942. The Germans, of course, are led by the guy we talked about last time, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, and he had advanced to the Egyptian city of El Alamein, which, and remember, Egypt was a British possession going into the war. So the British launch this massive attack, and it goes back and forth a little bit. Eventually, Rommel is forced to retreat. Eisenhower lands in Algeria and Morocco and wins big victories there. And Rommel basically has to flee the area. While we're on this, I want to quickly add the story of what ended up happening to Rommel. Although he was a leading general for Nazi Germany, he actually later participated in a plot to try and assassinate Hitler. The famed July 20th plot, as portrayed in the movie Valkyrie that Tom Cruise was in. It came to Hitler's attention. Rommel maybe was not a direct participant, but he was at least in the know. He knew what was going on, and this comes to Hitler's attention. So Hitler obviously decides that he's going to do away with Rommel. But the problem is that Rommel's a national hero, and the German confidence and morale was already suffering. So Hitler didn't want that to take any bigger of a hit than it already had by destroying a national hero in front of them. So he devises a plan, and he sends 2 officials to Rommel's house, and they knock on his door, and Rommel answers, and they basically tell him that Hitler is giving him a choice. One, they can arrest him. He can stand trial. He'll go before what they call a kangaroo court, where the outcome's already decided before it even happens. Be this big public trial. He'll be defamed, ultimately executed, and his family will suffer as well. This was common in Germany at that time under Hitler, that not only were traitors themselves punished, but their families could be punished after they were gone as well. So Hitler gives him that choice, or if he wants to avoid that, the two men had brought a cyanide capsule with them. And if Rommel agreed to take that and commit suicide right now, Hitler would pretend that he died of a stroke or something like that, give him a big state funeral, declare him a national hero, and move on from there, and his family wouldn't suffer. So Rommel talks to his family for a few minutes and ultimately decides he will take that second option. The two men drive him outside of his neighborhood there, and he takes the cyanide capsule. And that was the end of the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. Now we need to talk about really one of the most important battles of the entire war, the Battle of Stalingrad. And if you remember last time, we talked about how the Germans were advancing into the Soviet Union. The Russians were using scorched earth tactics as they backed up, burning everything in their path. The Soviets had already lost control of Leningrad, the former St. Petersburg, and now the Germans were trying to take Moscow, the capital, and Stalingrad, a city Stalin had literally named after himself. Of course, Stalin, with the city named after him, orders his troops to defend it to the death. And the battle begins in August of 1942. And here's the thing about Russia, is that at various times it can get really, really cold. So there's this brutal winter going on and this very bloody battle going on. The Soviets launch a counterattack. They actually trap the Germans, cut off their supplies. But of course, Stalin wasn't going to allow his troops to give up, and Hitler wasn't either. Hitler's general actually asks him for permission to surrender. Hitler won't give it, but eventually the German troops, beaten down, 90,000 of them frostbitten, starving almost to death, finally just quit fighting and give up on their own. This was so technically this is a Soviet victory. The Soviets win the Battle of Stalingrad, but I use the term victory loosely because over 1 million Soviets died in the process. But the reason it's so important for the war is what's going on at the very bottom here. The fact that the Germans were now on the defensive for the first time in the war. They're now sort of, the Soviets can start moving back towards Germany as opposed to the Germans moving further into the Soviet Union. So this is a huge turning point in the war. Let's talk very quickly about what was going on with the Allies at home. People on the home front had to rally to support them. Americans made a critical contribution. Soviet citizens made critical contributions as well. American factories converted to make weapons and supplies where they'd made other things. For example, automobile companies were now producing tanks and planes. Typewriter companies were producing shells and things like that. So they converted to make things for the war. And of course, with so many men gone at the war, women had to go to work as well. And you probably recognize the iconic figure, Rosie the Riveter, right there that I just circled. But because all this stuff is being funneled towards the war, whether it's nylon from stockings or soap or certain foods or rubber or anything, just like they did during World War I, they had to ration consumer goods again. So people could only buy certain limited amounts of various types of products. So that was an important part of the war effort. Another part of the war effort was propaganda, and we talked about that with World War I as well. And, you know, that can be both positive and negative, basically sort of very one-sided advertising in favor of your side's cause. One of the negative aspects of it was directed against Japanese Americans. And I want to show you, I think, one of the saddest photographs of the entire war in a second here. I'll give you a second to get this down, though, and mention that Japanese Americans, even those born in the United States, started to be looked at as potential enemies because the United States was at war with Japan. So we here in this country started to put them in essentially internment, prison camps. Now, we weren't killing them in the way that the Nazis were with the Jews, but the conditions were bad. People suffered, and certainly people died of diseases and other situations inside these camps, even as some Japanese Americans fought very bravely for the United States in the war. But most of their families were back in the internment camps. And of course had to leave their homes. Many Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast. Now, what seems especially unfair about this is that there are also plenty of German Americans and Italian Americans as well, but they were not put into prison camps in the same way. So it was a little bit of a double standard. I'm, in fact, like half German myself. And probably any number of you in that room have German heritage as well. I want to show you this photograph real quick, though. This is the front of a store owned by a Japanese American man. And he had to leave it and go to an internment camp. And all he left behind was a sign in the front of his store proclaiming proudly, "I am an American." He didn't want to be identified with the enemy. He was born here and wanted to be seen as an American in the same way that anyone else born in this country would be. So this, to me, as far as the home front part of the war, is probably one of the saddest photographs that I've seen telling that part of the story that was maybe a little bit unfair towards Japanese Americans at that time. So we've talked a little bit about fighting against the Germans, and we've talked a little bit about dealing with the Japanese as well. And we will certainly get back to both of those aspects of the war. But remember, Italy is involved on the Axis power side of this war as well. And in July of 1943, Allied forces land on the Italian island of Sicily, just off the coast of Italy, and they capture it from what was a combination of Italian and German troops. Now remember, the king, Victor Emmanuel, had essentially been forced to put Mussolini in power to begin with by sort of an angry mob insisting that he make Mussolini the leader, or Il Duce. Well, Mussolini is rapidly losing power as Italy comes to be dominated here. So Victor Emmanuel, the king, actually removes him from power and has him arrested. I don't have this up there, but Mussolini actually escaped shortly after that with the help of some Germans disguised as a German soldier, but then was hunted down the next day after his escape. And actually, when he realizes he's caught, he turns and says, "Shoot me in the chest," and it actually opened up his shirt, and he was in fact shot in the chest, and his body was taken back to Milan along with some members of his family and strung upside down in the streets. And as I mentioned last time, people did awful things to their bodies after they were dead. Meanwhile, it's only 1943. We still got a couple years to go in this war, but already Italy surrenders. The Germans try to take it back, but they're ultimately forced to retreat. So Italy is out of this war, and the Axis powers at this point are essentially just Germany and Japan. It's possible it may cut me off in the middle of this slide. I'm not totally sure what's going to happen when it hits 15 minutes, but I'll keep talking until it reaches that point. So now in 1943, the Allies realized they need to launch a large-scale invasion of Europe. And that was really the hardest part of this, was getting a large number of troops pushed into Europe and moving through France towards Germany. So they start to plan this secret invasion of France. And remember, you're thinking, oh, well, France, they're on the Allied side. But remember, France is controlled by Germany. So you're essentially invading territory that is controlled by Germany. They're going to go via the English Channel and invade France and begin their push towards Berlin. By May of 1944, this plan was ready. It was codenamed Operation Overlord, and they're going to attack on these beaches at Normandy. But it's not that simple, because the Germans, of course, knew that at some point an invasion was coming. So the Allies needed to be clever about this. They needed to not tip their hand as to exactly when or where. So they actually come up with this fake headquarters in this entire dummy army, and they place it off the coast of Calais, another French city, to make them think the invasion was going to come there. Instead, they invade at Normandy on June 6, 1944. And that's the other date that I'm going to ask you to know, along with the Pearl Harbor date that we talked about a couple of classes ago. So, the Germans had dug in along the coast. They've got machine guns. They've got cannons. They are ready for this invasion. The Allies know they're going to sustain heavy losses. I actually was watching something on the History Channel once where a guy who was there, and you can see in the bottom corner here the types of vehicles that sort of allowed the Allies to storm the beaches. These doors would open, they would wade through the water, storm onto the beach under heavy machine gun fire. Well, one of the generals inside one of those apparently pointed and said, "Gentlemen, see those 5 guys in the front row? 4 of them are going to be dead within the first 2 minutes." And sure enough, the Allies did sustain heavy losses. Just in one day, 2,700. If you've ever seen the first scene of Saving Private Ryan, that is supposedly a pretty accurate depiction of what happened. And I believe I'm about to get cut off here, so I will pick this up momentarily.